Thank you for inviting me back. It's always enjoyable. I recognize some faces. Nice to see some returnees. Thank you. Now I can share screen. So I hope I don't disappoint anybody. Right? We called it the Jewish Day of Love, and we'll get to that. But I think what we'll see is that what's interesting, that this day actually has quite a lot of different meanings attributed to it and associated to it. We'll try to trace some of them, not all, and we'll also try to see if we can draw any commonalities and conclusions about what this day represents and where the love is and who's loving whom and how then maybe it turned into Israeli Valentine's Day. Just to be very clear, right? This is not a day that's mentioned in the Torah. Okay? Tu B'Av, the 15th of Av, right? The Hebrew dates of the month add up the numerological value of the day, right? So this day is the 15th of Av, and we write it Tet Vav. We don't write it Yud He because that would have been God's name, right? So in Jewish numerology, 15 is not Yud He, even though that would be 10 plus 5. Okay? 15 is Tet and Vav. 9 plus 6. You have to be a very advanced math student, right? So that's how 2 becomes the 15th. And we have another 2 on our Jewish calendar. Right? Which one was that? That was 2 B'Shvat, the 15th of Shvat, which is the birthday of the trees, right, as people like to call it. It's one of the 4 Jewish New Years. And we will talk as we continue studying what might be the connections between, right, 2 B'Shvat and 2 B'Av. Maybe they're actually kind of 2 different dates on the 2 different ends of the Jewish calendar. We'll have to talk about what their connections might be. So we're talking about the day that's the 15th of Av. As I said, it's not a date that's mentioned in the Torah, but already in a minute we'll see, from the time of the Mishnah, it's acknowledged as being a very happy, joyous day. And in halakha, it's considered one of the minor festivals, like Tu B'Shvat, in which we do not have signs of mourning, so there's no hesped, there's no eulogy today, if God forbid there's a funeral. And in the morning service and in the mincha service, there's no tachanun, the prayers that recall troubles and distress and beseech God for mercy. Those prayers are left out on any day or even the day before at mincha in the afternoon of any joyous day. And Tu B'Av is included on that list. So it's important to note that while it's called a minor festival, right, according to halakha, it actually gets halakhic status, right? We're not allowed to have a eulogy. We don't say this additional prayer. So what's it about? There's a beautiful Mishnah, which is taught at the very end of the tractate of Ta'anit. It's the final Mishnah of Ta'anit. We'll look at part of it. We'll try to unpack parts of the Mishnah. And then I'll summarize some of the discussion in the Talmud about this Mishnah, which tries to then understand what's behind this day. And then we'll see that even in addition to the reasons given in the Talmud, there are even more reasons suggested in other sources as well. So the Mishnah teaches in the name of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, and it's important to note, right? Masechet Ta'anit, Ta'anit means fast days or the public fast days. Discussed, first of all, when fast days were ordained for times of distress, particularly lack of rainfall in the land of Israel. And the concluding chapter deals with the rabbinic fast days that are on the calendar. And in the Mishnayot, right before this one, right, it discussed what are the events that happened on the different rabbinic fast days, including the ones that we just had in the last 3.5 weeks, or 4 weeks. Okay? And then the final Mishnah ends on a more upbeat note. It says, there were never more joyous festivals in Israel than the 15th of Av and Yom Kippur. For on them, the maidens of Jerusalem used to go out dressed in borrowed white garments, so as not to cause shame to those who had none of their own. The maidens went out and danced in the vineyards, saying, young man, lift up your eyes and see what you are choosing. Don't pay attention to beauty, but rather look at the family. And in the continuation, the Mishnah brings verses to prove that family and virtue is valued over beauty, physical beauty. And then the Mishnah actually concludes with a very unusual verse, which we'll come back to in one of our later explanations, which is a verse from the Song of Songs, from Shir HaShirim, speaking about King Solomon and some of the joyous events in his life. We'll have to see what that might have to do with it. So this is our Mishnah, and it's quite a curious Mishnah because, what does it tell us? It tells us that there were never more joyous festivals than the 15th of Av and Yom Kippur. And then it seems to describe this, what seems like a very trivial or very human and very mundane ceremony, right? That the girls of Jerusalem would get dressed up in white garments. And it's nice, they're considerate, they don't want to shame anybody, so everybody would borrow clothes so that nobody could have fancier clothes than their friends. And then they would go out and dance in the vineyards, and it would be a courtship festival, right? And the girls would, what we might think, break some of the norms of modesty even. They initiate towards some of the men, right? But they give them a little bit of rebuke, and they tell them what's important, right, when you're looking for a match. And this is a very strange description. First of all, right, it's strange to compare Tu B'Av, a date that we don't know, and that's certainly not in the Torah, to Yom Kippur, right? Yom Kippur is the biblical fast day. It's the only day in the Torah that we're commanded to fast and to do other forms of physical affliction. And it's described in the Torah in very, very holy and supreme ways. It is the day in which we achieve atonement for our sins as individuals and as a nation. And it's the day of reconciliation between the Jewish people and God. So what does the day that we don't know anything about, Tu B'Av, have to do with Yom Kippur? I can understand the white garments on Yom Kippur. White is a sign of purity, and perhaps the dancing in the fields and the matchmaking is a sign of celebration and a feeling that Yom Kippur has been successful in bringing about atonement, right? So we could imagine that at the end of Yom Kippur, as part of the almost great relief of maybe the tension of sin and waiting for forgiveness, right? The custom emerged of going out dressed in white, a sign of purity, equality, right? Borrowing the garments. And what could be a better way of, right? A new start than let's make new Jewish families, right? Let's make matches. So I could maybe understand it relating to Yom Kippur. But what's Tu B'Av? And why are we having this celebration? And why would the Mishnah compare the joy of Tu B'Av to the joy of being forgiven from sin on Yom Kippur? And that's exactly the question that the Talmud asks. It says, of course, I understand why Yom Kippur is a great day of joy, but why Tu B'Av? What happened there? And the Talmud suggests 6 answers. I'll note them all. We'll discuss some of them in greater detail. And what I'll do is also reorder the list of the 6 answers so that they'll be in chronological order. I think that will help you. And then I'll add, after these 6 answers, some additional answers that are offered. And then at the end, right, maybe we'll try to answer, how did it get all of the commercial packaging these days as the Jewish Valentine's Day, right? How do all of these answers, right, and the origins connect? Okay, so again, our starting place is the comment in the Mishnah that we just read, that Tu B'Av and Yom Kippur are the most joyous days on the calendar. And as we noted, right, Yom Kippur we could understand, but what's Tu B'Av and what's behind the joy, and what would prompt that ritual of the women going out, right, to seek matches, and with their little rebuke of family and virtue over beauty? So the 6 answers, I have to say, it's actually, when I was preparing, I said this is actually quite a challenge, because the 6 answers require dabbling in 6 completely different contexts. Several of them are biblical, 2 are post-biblical, and they assume prior knowledge. And in the limited time that we have, right, it won't be honest to try to fully teach any of them. I'll mention them. We'll talk about some of them in greater detail, but part of what I hope is that it might spur your interest to actually check out some of these individual topics. And you'll see that it's quite a collection of these 6 answers, quite a range of answers in the Talmud. And one thing that we'll try to do after presenting them is see what commonalities. Are there any ways we can connect the dots, right? Or is it just 6 different random answers? I think we'll come to the conclusion that there are some commonalities. So the first answer suggested in the Talmud connects to a story in the book of Numbers, connected to Parashat Shlach, Numbers 14 and 15, 13 and 14, the story of the spies. Right? To quickly recap here, what happened was, right, the Jewish people were supposed to leave Egypt, go to Mount Sinai, enter the land, conquer the land, right, maybe build a temple, and Moshe was supposed to be the leader, and everybody was supposed to live happily ever after in the land of Israel. That was the plan, right? But the plan got taken off course because after leaving Egypt, the Jewish people marched to Mount Sinai. Moshe, after the 10 Commandments on Shavuot, went up to receive the tablets. Right, the Jewish people got anxious before he came down. They committed the sin of the golden calf, Chet HaEgel, and Moshe comes down, smashes the tablets upon seeing the golden calf, and then, right, Jewish history begins to get off course. Instead of continuing now and marching towards Eretz Yisrael, right, Moshe has to go up to heaven and atone, up to Mount Sinai, and talk to God and achieve forgiveness for the Jewish people and reconcile and receive a second set of tablets. And that takes us until Yom Kippur. So we've left Pesach time from Egypt. Half a year later, reconciliation with God. And the second tablets are the proof here. God has renewed the contract. And then, instead of beginning the march into Eretz Yisrael, the Jewish people have another sign of reconciliation with God, and that's the Mishkan, the tabernacle, which takes several months to erect. And they put the tabernacle up, they erect it in the next time that right before Pesach would come. So almost 11 and a half months after leaving Egypt. So we still haven't gotten to Eretz Yisrael. And then, right, we celebrate Pesach. And the plan would be to begin the march. And that's how Sefer Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, opened, getting us organized. And then what happened? There's some people who couldn't keep Pesach, so we have to wait another few weeks for them to keep the second opportunity of Pesach. And then the march begins, right, in the second month, in the month of Iyar, and it's very exciting. We're marching finally a year and a month after leaving Egypt, finally going to the land of Israel. And after a few stops, right, the Jewish people ask Moshe, can't we do this kind of on natural terms like all the other nations? Let's send some spies. And God agrees. Right, that's the version of combining the Deuteronomy version and the book of Numbers version. And the spies go with a list of questions from Moshe that they're supposed to come back and report. And they come back. There's several things that go wrong in their report, but the result is a catastrophe. The result is that they give the people a report that ends with the conclusion that it might be a great land, but it's not possible for us to be able to conquer it. And therefore, the people draw their own conclusion, may as well just go back to Egypt and call off the whole plan of going to the land of Israel. And the people weep that night, and God issues a very powerful ruling, a verdict, a punishment, that 1 day for each day, 1 year will be paid in the desert for each day that the spies traveled in the land of Israel, and that the Jewish people will have to serve the sentence of going nowhere for 40 years, or actually to complete the 40 years. And according to the Midrash, every year on the anniversary of that sin took place on Tisha B'Av, according to rabbinic tradition. And every year on the anniversary, the Jewish people dug graves and they waited. They climbed into the graves and they waited, knowing that some of them would need to die out that year, because that's all that happened for those 38 and a half more years in the desert. Until year 40, what happened was every year some people died. And right, every year the people that didn't die would get out of their graves and hang around another year and then another year. And in the 40th year, they did this again and dug graves and waited and waited, and nothing happened. And when the full moon came in the middle of the month of Av, a week after Tisha B'Av, they realized clearly the date has passed and the decree and the punishment have been lifted and nobody died. And that meant that we can now begin to move forward and conquer the land. And that, according to the rabbis in the Talmud, is one of the things that happened on Tu B'Av. On the 15th of Av, with the full moon in the sky, the people who had been waiting in their grave that year, like they had done for the last 38 years, understood that that's it. We can move forward. So this is a day in which the generation of the desert was able now to think about the future. Instead of just waiting in limbo for death, right, and waiting to finish serving their sentence, they could look forward to beginning the march to the land of Israel. That's the first of the 6 answers in the Talmud. The second answer connects to something that we read recently at the end of the book of Numbers in chapter 36, and that has to do with the daughters of Tzilafchad. This is not the time to describe who they are, but they are 5 daughters who present a very logical and well-reasoned argument to Moshe that they should deserve land in the land of Israel, even though women were not the recipients of a portion of land. And they suggest that the reason is because their father died without any sons, and they give various arguments, according to the rabbis, to prove, and their wish is granted by God. God says they're correct. And at the end of the book of Numbers in chapter 36, the Torah describes that they married their relatives in order to ensure that their father's portion of land would stay within their tribe. And that's the law that's taught. But in a later time, and that connects to the third answer, in a later time, that ruling was adjusted, and the decision was made that when a daughter who had no brothers inherited land, she is allowed to marry out of her tribe. And that sets a message and a tone that all tribes have a degree of equality and a degree of mutual opportunity for each other, right? And that marriages can be made across tribal borders. And that creates a greater sense of Jewish unity. And that would be, according to the Talmud, one of the events that allowance was made on Tu B'Av. And that would be one of the reasons for celebrating on Tu B'Av, that, wow, for the first time, Jews were actually allowed to marry outside of their tribe. The third answer in the Talmud refers to the story at the end of the book of Judges, a story that chronologically didn't necessarily happen where it's placed in chapter 21. It seems to be put there as an example of the chaos and disruption in the era of the Judges. The era of the Judges, to refresh, right? After Moses dies, Joshua enters the land with the Jewish people, conquers, helps the people settle. And after Joshua's death, we have a period of what are called the Judges, the Shuftim, who are basically tribal chieftains, right? They're more localized rulers. They don't necessarily rule over everybody. And it's a very, very tumultuous period. It's a period in which we have a cycle, kind of a vicious cycle, that when the going is good, right, the Jewish people are loyal to God and to the mitzvot, and they do what they're supposed to do, and they have some peace and quiet. But then, right, peace and quiet breeds contentment, and sometimes breeds a sense of self-aggrandizement, right, and a sense of security. And part of that comes along with rebelling against God and almost flirting and testing out the other local gods of the greater Middle Eastern cultures around the land of Israel. And as a result, God sends an enemy to punish the Jewish people. And then the Jewish people cry out to God and say, help, 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 right? We shouldn't have done that. And God sends a judge, a shofet, this local leader, to fight the enemy and save the people and restore calm and peace. But unfortunately, again, the cycle repeats itself. When the going is good, the people start to sin. And it's a period of time which is described in the book so aptly as a time when there isn't really clear leadership. There's no king in Israel, is how the book sums things up. And as a result of having non-centralized leadership and these evolving or revolving doors of localized leaders, it becomes a period of lawlessness and a period of chaos and a period sometimes of vigilantes. And the final chapter of the book of Judges, which again, most of the commentators read as having happened earlier, but having been written at the end as a summary, is a pretty gruesome version of lawlessness. You can explore it if you're curious. It's a very difficult story to read. The end result of the story, though, is it ends with a brutal murder. The end result of the story is that there is a ban placed on marrying the tribe of Benjamin. And there's basically a civil war, right, and a ban on one tribe of Israel being able to marry the other tribes. And this ban was lifted and the civil war was resolved on Tu B'Av. And in the book of Judges, it describes the dancing of the maidens in the vineyards of the city of Shiloh in Binyamin as a sign of reconciliation between the tribes, that the women and the men from different tribes could meet. And that, according to the Talmud in Masechet Ta'anit, is again one of those early origins of the day of Tu B'Av. So those so far are three of the reasons, and those each are connected to stories, right, in the Torah and in the book of Judges. The next reason, right, I'm now giving two of the reasons out of order just to help you in chronological order. The next reason takes us into the period of the kings. After this lawless period of the judges when there is no centralized leadership and no king, right? Then the Jewish people come to the last of the judges, Samuel, who's also a prophet, and say, can we please have a king? We want to be like all the other nations. And Samuel says, I don't think you're going to like a king. He's going to tax you. He's going to take your kids to the draft. They're going to serve in the army. They're going to be servants. I don't think you're going to like a king, but the people say yes, 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 right? And God consents that they can pick a king, right? And we have the first king, King Saul. God chooses not to continue his line of rulers. God picks David. David's son Solomon rules, and the promise to both David and Solomon is that each of them will be the head of a line of descendants, and that was supposed to be the royal line. But in Solomon's time, right, we begin to already have dissent, and the result is the split of the kingdom and the split of 10 tribes from the kingdom of Judah, which are the descendants of King David and Solomon. And the first king of the northern kingdom, the non-Judean kingdom, did something to make his empire very, very distinct from the kingdom to the south, the kingdom of Judea and Jerusalem. He wanted to be sure that nobody from his kingdom, with the 10 tribes, could go worship in Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. And he put up roadblocks and guards to block the roads to Jerusalem. And he set up alternative worship sites in the north and in the south. in Dan and in Beersheba, so that you have no need to go worship in the temple. And that was the beginning of a series of kings in that northern kingdom who worshipped lots and lots of idolatry and led to the ultimate destruction of that kingdom before Jerusalem and the southern kingdom were destroyed. The final king of that northern kingdom, Hosea ben Ela, did something which we would think is a cause for celebration, right? And the rabbis in the Talmud say that is one of the reasons for Tu B'Av. He took away the guards on those roadblocks, and he opened up the possibility that people from his kingdom could go worship in Jerusalem. So on the one hand, that's great, and we celebrate, and that's Tu B'Av. But, right, the rabbis teach that it turned out not to be such a good thing, because what he did was, instead of having the monarch be the one who blocks the people from going by keeping the guards and the roadblocks in, now the burden of choice fell on the people. And guess what? The people of the kingdom of Israel were not too interested in the temple in Jerusalem. And when they chose not to go, the rabbis teach, that brought the hasty, quick end of the northern kingdom and the attack of the Assyrians during Hosea's very own time. So while on the one hand, it's a celebration because great, Jews can now interact, right? Mix, mingle, go to the temple. Unfortunately, the people chose not to do that. So that's one of the other reasons that the Talmud brought. Then the Talmud brings two other reasons, which are post-biblical, it seems. And the comment is that Tu B'Av is a day of celebration because it's the last day on which you could chop the wood for the altar in the temple. And it explains that because starting from Tu B'Av, the seasons begin to change. There's more moisture in the air here in the land of Israel. And the wood would have some kinds of moisture, which wouldn't make it good for burning on the altar. There might be worms in it. It could mildew, the Talmud says. And that's a cause for celebration. Now that's a weird one, right? And the commentators have to try to explain, why would that be a cause for celebration? And some of the commentators give a very interesting explanation. They say, of course it's a cause for celebration. Chopping wood for the altar was a big job. And if that job is over, then guess what? We now have more time to devote to religious pursuits. We can study Torah, we can visit the temple, right? We don't have to be out chopping wood. That's a great thing. And that, some of the commentators explain, is the cause of the celebration of Tu B'Av. Go figure, right? We'll see what else we can come up with. And the final explanation in the Talmud, again, final as far as chronologically goes, tells that on Tu B'Av, a group of martyrs, group of corpses, were brought to burial. And that was a huge cause of celebration. Sorry, it should say Beitar with an A. And this refers back to something some of us talked about on Tisha B'Av when we studied together, that one of the tragedies that the rabbis say happened on the 9th of Av happened 65 years after the destruction of the Second Temple. It happened in 135 of the Common Era in the city of Beitar in the Judean hills, today in Gush Etzion, near Gush Etzion. And what happened there was that some of the rebels who were still the last stronghold rebelling against the Romans had fled to the countryside and had established some kind of fortress there in Beitar, and they were attacked and massacred on Tisha B'Av. And they were not allowed to be brought to burial that year in 135 of the Common Era. And it's not exactly clear which Roman king later allowed them to be brought to burial, but a great miracle happened according to the rabbis, and their bodies, their corpses, had not decayed and decomposed. And their bodies were intact and able to be brought to burial. And that, according to the Talmud, is one of the causes of celebration for Tu B'Av. The celebration that Jewish bodies, right, especially martyrs, people who died al Kiddush Hashem, they were killed as Jews, could be brought to Jewish burial. And that is a great cause of celebration. And just in parentheses, we'll add that not only is this burial connected to Tu B'Av, but it's also connected to Birkat HaMazon, to the grace after meals, because according to rabbinic tradition, the fourth bracha of Birkat HaMazon was established to mark and give praise to God for their burial. It's the bracha of God being merciful and good and benevolent. And according to the rabbis, it's speaking about this scene of their burial. So we had 6 suggestions in the Talmud to try to explain the Mishnah, which said, my gosh, the 2 happiest days on the Jewish calendar are Yom Kippur, which we said we understand why, right? And Tu B'Av. And Tu B'Av, the rabbis in the Talmud said, what happened then, right? Why are we so happy, right? And they gave 6 reasons that span from the generation at the end of the 40 years of the desert to 135, the Martyrs of Beiter, who were subsequently brought to burial. In the middle, 2 stories connected to tribes being able to marry each other, and then the roadblocks being removed, which on the one hand meant that Jews could come to celebrate and worship in the temple, but it also meant that the Northern Kingdom Jews had to choose, do they want God or do they want idolatry? And guess what? They chose idolatry. And the other one about the wood, right? The wood chopping day. It's the end of wood chopping season, and that's a cause for celebration. So what do some of these have in common, right? Are they just random 6 things that they thought had happened on Tu B'Av? Perhaps not, right? Several of them, they don't all 6 share all of them, but some of these 6 share the theme of unity of the Jewish people, opportunities to reconnect as people, temple-wise, marriage-wise. Certainly many of them share the theme of the connection to the temple or the land, right? The verdict of the spies is now lifted, and this group of people can proceed and enter into the land. That's great. The martyrs on the other end of the spectrum, right, who were the last stronghold of rebels against the Romans, also represented almost a messianic vision of commitment to the land, and right, they died for that. And how appropriate they're able to be brought to Jewish burial in the land. And the stories in the middle have to do with inheritance, marriage, starting families, and the agricultural cycle of the land. And several of these stories also have a tshuva element, a repentance, a purification from sin element, a reconnecting to God, a new slate element. And perhaps it's these commonalities that lead the Mishnah to draw the conclusion that Tu B'Av and Yom Kippur, yeah, they're both those joyous days. And that's why the young people responded in the same way, right? They talked about equality. They talked about starting new families, right? They talked about virtue over beauty, right? They found those common elements both in Yom Kippur and in Tu B'Av, commitment to the people, to the land, to the temple, and to God. What's interesting, right, and from there we've got a far cry to the contemporary Israeli Valentine's Day, or not, right? Some additional reasons about why Tu B'Av is such a joyous day. And I actually found it very exciting when I was preparing how much I was able to learn and broaden my knowledge as well. So I thank you all for the opportunity, and thank Julie for the opportunity to let me probe. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're kind of doing a potpourri, but it's a potpourri in order to try to tease out what kind of significance has been attributed to this day over the centuries. And it's a day that, as we said, not only has what's called meaning, it also has halakhic practical ramifications because, as I mentioned, no eulogies, we don't say the tachanun penitential prayers, and those things don't happen on every day of the year. It's a finite number of days a year when the rabbis grant those exemptions. And so what's behind this day? Some additional reasons. An additional reason, again, connected to wood chopping, has to do with a teaching in the Talmud right before the rest of these 6 reasons, a few pages before in the Talmud. And that refers to something mentioned in the book of Nechemiah in chapter 10. I'll give the background here very much in short. Right? Nechemiah is one of the leaders of the return to Zion. After the destruction of the first temple, the Jewish people left with the promise that they would return 70 years later. And there were several rounds of returnees. None of these rounds of returnees have masses coming. The masses stayed back in Babylonia, where they had built very nice, comfortable Jewish communities. They chose to stay in the diaspora. And those who came back faced great hardship in trying to settle the land, begin to build the temple, or at least a basic structure of the temple, and to begin to strengthen the fortifications of Jerusalem. And one of the crises that they faced was devastation, physical damage in the land. The land had been destroyed, and there wasn't wood. And they had built the altar, but there weren't trees to chop, right? Enough trees to chop, to have wood to burn on the altar and to offer sacrifices. And they established, the book of Nehemiah in chapter 10 describes that there was kind of a tax, almost like a wood chopping tax, or it was more of an offering, a voluntary offering, that different tribes took upon themselves to find wood and be able to bring wood for offering the sacrifices. And according to the Talmud here, on Tu B'Av, that was the day that all the people who had returned, who had problematic lineage and couldn't prove which tribe they were from, they got the opportunity to bring the wood. And that seems to be another cause of celebration. It's not on the main list of the 6, but the Talmud says that that event also happened on Tu B'Av, which is interesting, because here too is another opportunity of the mixing. We're going to blur the lines a little. We don't exactly know which tribe this person's from, but that's okay. We'll accept them, and they can be part of the reconnection with God, people, land, and temple. So that's another suggestion about what happened on Tu B'Av. In halakha, we're reaching the last 3-4 minutes. In halakha, this is also a date with important significance on the agricultural calendar. There are laws connected to trees and fruits and vegetables that grow in the land of Israel. And there are very clear definitions of how, when necessary, how we count a halakhic year, to be able to count the age of a tree, or to be able to know if we are planting close or near to the sabbatical year when it's forbidden to count. And the halakha teaches that 44 days before Rosh Hashanah is the cutoff. And when does 44 days fall? Right? Tu B'Av, which means that a tree that's planted before Tu B'Av, it's as if in halakhic terms, it grows a whole year between then and Rosh Hashanah. And then, right, the next year, right, it's already in year 2 when Rosh Hashanah starts. And that has halakhic ramification for the laws connected to which year you can begin to enjoy the fruit of a tree, when you can uproot something before the sabbatical year, much more complicated laws than we'll get into now. But it's interesting to note that it's a date on the calendar as far as the agricultural mindset in Eretz Yisrael. When I plant, if I plant before Tu B'Av, it's considered one stage. And if I plant after, it's considered another stage. And then there are other sources that suggest that the agricultural calendar of the land of Israel actually has sort of 6 seasons, not a classic 4. And that's based on what God promised Noah after the flood, that there would be 6 seasons. And that the period that begins from Tu B'Av marks this new period, which is not what's called summer, it's the next one. So it's hot, but it's not as hot. And we saw that in the case of the chopping of the wood, that after this date, right, there's more moisture in the air, there might be mildew, there might be worms. So also, right, this is the beginning of a new technical season, and some scholars suggest that Tu B'Av was an ancient agricultural festival in Eretz Yisrael because it marked the transition into this post-summer, pre-fall, and it's when the grapes are being harvested. It's the very, very beginning of the olive crop, and that it might have been some ancient harvest experience as well. And in some of Chassidut, Tu B'Av is marked as the beginning of the days of judgment, and so much so that in certain forms of Chassidut, they even begin to wish each other, right, the good year messages starting from the 15th of Av. And a final suggestion is in the late 19th century by the Hasidic rabbi Rav Tzadok HaKohen. He actually connects that if all of the bad things that happened on Tisha B'Av happened on the 9th of Av, their repair, like we saw in the story of the Martyrs of Beiter, their repair happens on the 15th of Av, on Tu B'Av. And he suggests that in the future, just like the martyrs were brought to burial on the 15th of Av, having been massacred on the 9th of Av, he suggests that the two temples which were destroyed on the 9th of Av will be rebuilt on the 15th of Av. And then we get to, right, the contemporary. So how far off is it or isn't it, right? On the one hand, right, it's a great commercialization, right? Everybody needs to make a living, right? And restaurants and stores turned this into a great opportunity. But maybe it's not so far-fetched, right? First of all, right, as we saw, the date has some pretty ancient roots. It has roots about marriage and matchmaking. That was the Mishnah, right? The girls go out, right? It talks about the difference between beauty and virtue, right? It's a date connected to tribes being able to marry, barriers being broken down between different parts of the Jewish people. It's a date of recommitment to the land, right? The verdict of the spies is over. We're here in the land. So some, right, contemporary writers suggest that maybe it's not so terrible, right, that this date has been adopted for commercial purposes. And it's fair to note that in many circles, the date has really been turned into a very positive opportunity for proactive matchmaking, trying to make introductions. In the city of Shiloh in Binyamin, there still is the custom of people coming dressed in white to go out and dance in the vineyards together and try to start Jewish families in the land and reconnect. And in many ways, it's a day that in the national collective memory is kind of a huge sigh of relief after the 3 weeks in Tisha B'Av. It's the day, and we see it in the different events that the rabbis point to over the ages into the Hasidic masters of the 19th century. It's a day in which, as a nation, we look to the next step. We look past the tragedies, we look past destruction, right? And we talk about new possibilities, relationships, connection to the land, reconnecting with God, potential at the temple, right? The wood offering. We talk about breaking down barriers between the tribes. It's a day of hope. It's a day of love in the greatest sense. Right? And it's a day of new possibilities. And, right, it really is kind of the bridge to the high holiday season. So I know that, right, this year, especially for so many of us, right, the high holiday season is just fraught now with big questions of what it's going to look like and how it's going to feel. But perhaps we should take some of the messages of hope and unity and new possibilities that Tu B'Av brings, right, and use that as the kickoff for the high holiday season. Instead of only focusing on what we don't have this year, right, let's focus on, right, what possibilities are available and open to us, perhaps under our unusual circumstances. So I'm happy to take any questions if you have. Hope that everybody learned something. I learned while I prepared and enjoyed.